I'm Becky Thompson with Nania Energy, and joining me today is Aaron Raftery, also of Nania. And we're going to throw down over the next 30 minutes some of the tougher questions maybe that you may have rolling around in your head that aren't always directly answered as it comes to solar. So with that, so we'll do a brief introduction as to who Aaron and I are and kind of our backgrounds and where we're coming from today, and just briefly about our firm, Nania Energy, and kind of the barometer of how we're sharing these questions with you. But then we'll get right into the meat and the potatoes of considerations and questions when you're maybe first starting out your solar process, whether you're still in the evaluation mode or where you may be. But also there may be some of who've been looking at this for quite some time and maybe are stuck in the middle or looking at the late phases of a project, some of the questions that you may have. So Becky Thompson, I've been with Nania Energy for over 10 years, and I specialize in electricity and natural gas supply procurement and risk management for public and higher education school facilities. And I'm really excited to introduce Aaron Raftery to you today. He's one of the newest members of our team, but certainly not new to this industry. He has over a decade of experience from lighting retrofits to efficiency. He worked at Train for a period of time, and most recently with a solar company directly. And he now joins our team as our solar and efficiency expert to act on behalf of our clients as they navigate these sometimes kind of tricky waters when it comes to some of these efficiency and solar projects. So how do we fit into the mix? We're talking to your board, we're helping you identify opportunities and threats in the marketplace and really sit on your side of the table. And so this is the same concept with our Nania Efficiency and Solar Group. It's just doing it through the lens of efficiency and solar projects. So it's more of like an owner's rep model, if you're familiar with that at all, where we're representing your interest instead of maybe a third-party solar developers kind of pushing their interest and not really listening to all of the needs and wants that you may have at your specific site. And we found that this works really well in culmination with what we're already doing. Our end goal is to achieve long-term energy cost management, and that is both through the rate that you pay, but also the usage that you consume every year. So the conservation along with the procurement works really well. And so I'm really excited that we have Aaron and this new group joining us. So as I've already touched on, we're not trying to sell solar panels. These are questions that we've gotten repeatedly from our clients, and we just want to share with everyone because if you may be able to familiarize yourself or feel familiar with this, is that solar to me is a big giant gray area. It's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving. The legislation gets signed, but maybe it's not actually put into action right away. And it's always just kind of this fuzzy area. And so we're going to try and clear up some of that fuzziness for you today and give you some tangible takeaways for some of the tougher questions that maybe you've had. And so that's really what we're going to dive into. So as I touched on that owner's rep process, this is what that process looks like. It's that, again, that barometer of how we're sharing those answers today is from where we're sitting from the feasibility study to distinguish if solar even makes sense, and if so, for which of your facilities. Not everyone is a good candidate for solar, and that's a really important piece. That should really be step one for you. And then kind of going through the process and guiding and helping answer the questions and act in your best interest always, as these are very long-term commitments of an electrical system that you're potentially putting on your rooftop. So with that, let's dive right in. So Aaron, are you ready? I'm about to grill you for the next 15 or 20 minutes, so I hope that you're ready.
Ready.
This first one, it seems like a simple enough question, but I have a feeling that the answer is going to be kind of complex. Let's say you have just been you're a public entity, a school district, or a private higher ed facility. You've heard about solar, you know that there's money out there, you're getting a lot of phone calls about it, it's on your to-do list. Where do you start? What's step one?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start, if possible, is with some type of kind of like preliminary analysis that gives us an idea if solar even makes sense for the particular customer or the particular property in question. The vast majority of existing buildings right now probably are not immediately solar ready, right? And so maybe solar is not like a near-term viable thing. And so kind of the earlier we can figure that out, the better. If that's the case, just kind of set the right amount of expectations. And then also kind of early in the process, like to get an idea, there's a couple of different options, like ownership options available to customers, whether they buy the system themselves and they own it and maintain it themselves, or if they work with a third party that owns it through a power purchase agreement. And so usually I like to kind of look at some of those options early in the process as well, and because that can kind of shape some of the later decisions that are made. In my experience, usually customers are working directly with like a solar company on these viability analyses, and there's a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of bias there, right? And that the solar company is clearly kind of motivated to do a project, right? And so maybe that's not the most neutral kind of party, I guess, to do that analysis. Here we're looking at what does the project cost? What are all the qualifying incentive amounts? What's the expected energy savings? How much of my electrical load can I offset through solar? And so these are all really important kind of big picture questions that can be answered pretty early in the process through this feasibility study. And then the next page is just usually like to give some type of visual indication of what a project might look like as well, and define this board members in particular. I mean, not exclusively board members, but for whatever reason, board members really like to see like visual, representations of the project. So these are just, like I said, these are kind of just a couple of examples of what a good feasibility study I think looks like. But generally speaking, this first step, if done right, we should be looking kind of disqualifying more properties than we are kind of qualifying them, because it just doesn't make sense for every building. So.
Well, and I think it's really interesting that this is your step one, because there's so many instances where my clients, the developers want them to sign a letter of intent before they will give them any tangible numbers or help them kind of prioritize. So they're essentially asking them to kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit. So I love that this is what you perceive as step one, because then it makes sense. For if I'm a school, right, I have 10 million other hats that I'm wearing a day.
Right.
I don't want to go through all of this for all of my buildings and then find out after the RFP that it's not a viable project, right? I would rather know upfront and then use my resources where it makes the most sense. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
I think everyone probably they're getting a lot of calls, specifically in Illinois or other states where there are really robust incentive programs. Specifically for solar, and there's this inherent sense of urgency, like you have to do something now or else you're going to miss out. Is that actually the true landscape of what's going on? Or tell me about these incentives and where they stand.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of the times the reason for that communication of urgency is because historically that was the case. The solar industry in general for the last 10, 15 years has been very contingent on incentives to make projects financially viable. And the incentive programs have tended to kind of go boom and bust. And so, I think a lot of the solar companies that are communicating that sense of urgency are probably, probably coming from that perspective, but the things have changed in pretty recently in the last year or two. On the federal level, for example, the main incentive program for solar was changed last year, and it was structured in a way that calls for a 10-year program runway starting this year. So we're really looking at almost 10 full years remaining on that program. And then in Illinois, where I know most of our attendees are from, the Illinois state incentives also kind of were a little bit rocky, a little bit boom and bust when they launched 5 or 6 years ago, but those also have been kind of revamped. That was 2 years ago, and the new program launched last year, and that also was intended to be a 10-year program. So I think in both cases we're really looking at should be close to a 10-year time horizon I don't want to miscommunicate and tell people that they should wait, like count on it, right? Because 10 years is a long time. There's could be some political changes and all these sorts of things, but certainly the sense of urgency, I think that sometimes floats around these solar projects is maybe not quite so much. And so we do have a little bit more time to kind of really make sure that we do a good, follow a good process for doing our project. So. Yeah, but I think that's where that most of that comes from.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's relieving to hear, because when the first blocks of solar renewable energy credits opened up in Illinois through the adjustable block program, it was like a mad dash, and people were slapping their information down on it just to get in the queue. And they're like, we haven't even brought it up to our board. We just want to make sure, like, if the money disappears, that we have a chance at it. And so it was kind of a backwards process that we'll do our due diligence later. We just don't want to miss out on the incentives. So I'm glad that they kind of cooled that down so you can go about this the right way and the money will still be there.
Yeah, me too.
So let's switch gears a little bit. This is a question I've gotten at every single board meeting that I've talked to about solar, is safety of solar panels, right? I don't think anyone believes that this isn't a large electrical system that you're effectively tying to your own electrical system. And I think we've probably all heard the horror stories of fires, the new 4-letter word in solar. What's your take on the safety of putting on an electrical system like distributed generation, like solar, onto your school or university?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think, like, just speaking generally, in generalities, the solar array, right, which solar array is like the solar system, right, the solar panels and all of the components. A solar array there's nothing inherently unique about a solar array compared to other pieces of electrical infrastructure, right? So what that means then is that it is susceptible to an electrical fire, just like other, again, electrical systems. And for that reason, it's very important that it's installed by qualified professionals, right? I mean, again, it's kind of an obvious statement, but it's an important one. So I think there's two components to that. So there's nothing really unique about solar that I guess that makes it unsafe, but at the same time, it is a large electrical system, and so you need to make sure that it's done properly. I think for customers that are just like absolutely like extremely risk averse, and just some different people have different appetites for risk, and someone is extremely risk averse, I mean, that could be a reason not to do on-site solar, I guess, right? It could be a reason to look at off-site options. But I think for kind of put things in perspective, I think it's good for us to be aware that we are putting solar panels on critical building stock, right, as a country. Like, if, for example, like water treatment centers, data centers that we all rely on to keep our life moving, right? Like on this webinar, right? Data centers and military bases, right? Like, all these are examples of solar deployment. So I think it's I think that might kind of help put things in perspective a little bit. But again, like I said, each person has their own risk appetite, and that's something we want to be sensitive to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an important point to note, that military bases and other things that are taxpayer funded or typically risk adverse and have a lot to protect, protecting their asset, and they're exploring these options as well is really good insight.
Yeah.
So what if you're just starting the process? What's our timeline looking like from soup to nuts? Like from the time that I bring it up to my administrators and try to get this approved to the time that it's actually producing energy at my facilities. I've heard of some pretty stark supply chain issues since COVID. Like, where do we stand today?
Yeah, that's going to vary somewhat depending on kind of the size of the array, and then also a little bit depending on who your electric utility is. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, I would suggest utilizing like a 12-month time frame, kind of in the back of the mind when you're thinking through this. That it might be a couple months faster, it might be a couple months longer, but 12 months should be a real good kind of right order of magnitude for how long to expect on a project.
That's great, because that's in like 100% improvement from what it was even like 18 months ago. It was
Yeah.
or someone
Yeah.
waiting on a transformer that was on a ship out somewhere and they were waiting for it to come in. So that's good to know that it can be that quickly turned around. So let's go into, all right, we've done the RFP, we've done all of that. Now we're maybe in the middle of the project, right? A scenario that some people may be in is that they've been talking about solar for several years. Maybe they've even run an RFP, they've gotten some bids, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't moved forward. What's the next step to reevaluate options and get the ball rolling again?
Yeah. So I think so the answer is partially going to depend on why the project didn't move forward before.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a very specific reason, obviously, then that would be unique to that. But generally speaking, you definitely would want to get updated pricing, and you want to get an update on the incentive estimates. So on the pricing point, back to your the point you just made, supply chains were kind of crazy the last couple of years. Obviously that affected pricing, and so there was a recent study that came out just in the last few weeks that said that solar panel pricing is at a 2-year low, for example. Great. So yeah. But so definitely you'd want to get in labor. Obviously labor pricing is going to vary, but it's be time sensitive. So you want to get updated pricing for sure. The incentive programs, like I said, those are relatively stable at the federal level, and then certainly in the Illinois state level, but they're stable at this point moving forward, but they have changed in the last year or so. And so again, you want to update those as well. And then the other thing I'd say here is if you like this scenario could be a good example of where you might want to bring in an owner's representative to, there's a variety of reasons why a project might stall, right? And just an owner's rep might kind of help keep the various pieces tied together, so to speak. So anyways, that could be a good scenario where changing things around this time around and bringing in an owner's rep might make sense.
Yeah. What a great point. And it made me think of, the energy supply market has changed so much too. Just in the last 18 months, for some people, their rates have doubled. So if you have to operate within a certain ROI threshold, and you looked at this a couple of years ago, your energy price that you're paying to the grid has probably gone up in a substantial way, where that ROI now maybe pencils and makes sense and falls below that threshold for a project to move forward. So when you're getting those refreshes on labor cost and material cost, make sure that you also get a refresh and use your most recent utility data, because it's probably going to look a lot different from the last time that you did this. You had mentioned that there's various reasons why someone wouldn't move forward, why a project wouldn't move forward. Do you mind just sharing like what's like your number one that you see, that's your experience as to why they could get to this point in the game and then it stall?
Yeah, that's so I mean, I don't know, I have like a number one, I'm like a top couple. I think sometimes it just might be that the project is not viable, right? Like you're kind of like trying to force it, right? And so it's just at the end of the day, maybe it just wasn't a viable project to begin with. Yeah. From a cost and constructability standpoint. Another reason might be that the project wasn't all that financially compelling, right? Like I've had, like we're doing that feasibility study type of assessment, and so my, like maybe the project is constructible and like it'll work and all that, but just doesn't save all that much money, and it's not worth the time, right? That could be a reason. In which case, getting a pricing refresh again could be a good one for that one. And then I think the other one is just there's not enough bandwidth at the time. I mean, just obviously putting solar on their buildings is not the kind of the full-time job of these customers, right? And so it just might be competing priorities, and they just never got around to kind of finalizing a project. So yeah,
thanks. I was just curious. That's really good insights. This is a long-term commitment, right? Solar contracts can be 20, 25 years plus, and it's a large electrical infrastructure you're adding to potentially your property and to your rooftop. And it comes with a pretty substantial price tag as well. How do you bring this up in a way to those new administrators, those new team players, in a way that's not going to stonewall the project and kind of keep things going?
Yeah, so I think again, again, every board and every board member is potentially unique, right? And so right. But I mean, again, that's kind of goes without saying, but I said it anyways. But so And this thing, this is another good scenario where like, if you do have an owner's rep involved, like you really can lean on that,
Yeah.
that, individual or individuals to kind of have them do a lot of the board presentations and education. And so this would be a nice time to utilize that owner's rep if you have one involved. I think in my experience, like a lot of times there's like certain board members may be really, really motivated and excited over a solar project, especially for public schools. I mean, I just found, I have private schools for that matter. I mean, I found a lot of times that a board member, it may be something that they're pretty excited about and passionate about. And so if that's the case, I would suggest being open to that, right? And if a board member wants to be more involved, then I would usually kind of treat that as a good thing and let them. And I think to your, the way you phrase the question, as far as as far as slowing things down, I think the long-term nature of these decisions are such that if a board member isn't feeling wants a little bit more time, I would actually usually encourage you to give them more time, right? As opposed to just getting a no vote from that one individual board member. So I think that the fact that these solar projects are going to be a legacy that the current board is going to bestow upon future boards, right? Because they're like, and so yeah. I think that that's important just to be a little bit aware of and potentially be open to slowing things down, particularly given the fact that the incentives aren't as time sensitive anymore. Yeah. So, yeah. So that's, I think I
think that's such an important point. And I think if you come from it with that perspective and understanding of maybe the position that they're in, you're going to get more buy-in and more support and less kind of like, headbutting over it. I love that. And what we've done on the supply side too is there's some people I've talked to, they have 5 or 6 new board members, bless them. So just doing an informational board meeting just to let them know where things stand with no agenda, right? Like no consent. We're not asking for anything. We're just sharing the facts and letting you know the work we've done up to this point. And then just knowing that eventually there may be a point where we bring this back to you to continue its forward moving. So what great insight. I wanted to specifically leave this for the last question that you and I addressed, Aaron, because it's one of the most complex, honestly. I think we could talk about it for 45 minutes, but it's also one of the most important, and that's specific contract considerations. If you've ever had to review a power purchase agreement or an ownership model for solar, they're pretty lengthy, they're jargon heavy, and they're written generally by the solar developer company themselves. So what are some of the most important things that those on the call should be aware of and kind of note when they're reviewing these contracts?
Yeah, I think to your point, this is, a very meaty topic, keeping it somewhat kind of to just kind of cherry picking some of the more common things. First, I think the answer will vary depending on if you are using a purchase model where you're owning the system yourselves, or if you're using a third-party ownership model. Those would be 2 entirely different contracts. Under the scenario where you're owning the system and you're buying it outright, then your contract is going to look very similar to just a typical construction contract. So anything, so any like general construction considerations would also apply here. Typically, I think one difference or one unique aspect to it is there is an energy savings component to these projects, and so a big question there is, are those energy savings being guaranteed by that solar provider? And if they are offering a guarantee, then I would pay kind of close attention to how that guarantee is written, because there's different ways to structure a guarantee, and there's like some guarantees have kind of more teeth to them than others, if that makes sense. And so I'd like to see a guarantee. You can't, you have to be within reason, right? Can't structure it in such a way that there's going to be no counterparty that'll ever sign the guarantee, but there's levels of skin in the game that we can expect of the solar companies and that are offering that guarantee, and I'd like to see that.
Right.
Also, under this scenario where the school is owning the system, under that scenario, the incentives will also be going to the school, typically. And so I'd like to see some language in that contract that spells out how they're going to secure those incentives. So you don't really want the school to be, or the customer, whether it's a school or whatever entity, you don't want them to be kind of left hanging to secure the incentives on their own. We'd like to see some language in there that spells out how the solar company is going to secure the incentives on behalf of the customer.
Yeah.
And then under the third party ownership, that would typically be a longer contract. And so there's even more to it there a little bit, but a couple of things. One is at the end of the contract term, I'd like to see some, there's language in there that the solar company will come in and remove that solar array at their cost. And you might want to include a decommissioning bond in there to make sure that there's money in place, 20, 30 years down the road to do that. And then also there's usually an annual escalation on the rate that's being, the power is being sold under that. And I'd like to see that annual escalation be at 1.5% or lower typically. So, and that's the contracts I've seen, or the proposals I've seen recently have been at like 2.5, even 3%. So this is not, this is very applicable. So I really would strongly encourage those PPA rates to be less than 1.5%. So.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And, so a PPA is usually structured like, okay, this is what you're currently paying. This is what we anticipate electricity costs to be from the utility over the next 25 years. And here's the savings that we can show you. So those escalators, to Aaron's point, can get really hairy really quickly, especially if they're tacking them on to the utility cost as well and expecting that utility cost will increase 3% every year. Because if we looked at the 25-year history, that's just not the case. There is some inflation that you have to account for, but overall, that's not a stringent 3% increase year over year. So getting back to, making sure that you kind of double check those savings and verify that everything's actually accurate. Those small little percentage points can really make or break a project very quickly. So thank you all for joining us today.